Hello and welcome to the garden. So just a short video about this little plant I've got here. And I've been away from the garden for some weeks now, and while I was away, this little fella arrived. It was okay, my mum unpacked it for me and gave it a drop of water. That's why I'm not unboxing it today. So this has come from Suttons. Now I had an email from them a few weeks ago saying that they'd used one of my videos in one of their blog articles, and that article was all about advice on how to grow and look after cherry trees, and they'd put a link in there to one of my pruning videos, which was very nice indeed. But they also offered a choice of one of two different cherry plants, and I could pick one if I wanted, no obligation, and they would send me a free cherry plant. And of course I've got 5 old varieties of cherry in the fruit cage, and I don't have a lot more room there for another. So there were 2 different trees that they offered. One was Sweetheart as a normal maiden cherry tree, and I probably don't have room for that, to be honest. Maybe I could have found a place to squeeze it in, but cherry trees can be a little bit big. And the other was this little Patio cherry, as it's referred. This is Sylvia, sort of a mini cherry, and I've got to be honest, neither of those varieties particularly interest me. Sweetheart, if you want a modern cherry variety, it's perfectly all right, but usually I'm growing old varieties, so all of my cherry trees are pretty old sorts. Nothing more modern than, I don't know, they're at least the 1800s, so, and some of them a bit older than that. So that's the sort of thing I like to grow. So Sweetheart doesn't particularly interest me as a variety, though it's a perfectly fine cherry, and not a bad one if you want a modern variety of cherry. And because I don't really have room for it, I decided I'd give this little Patio cherry a go. Now I have to confess that I don't have particularly high hopes for it, because I have seen a few of these and I haven't seen great results. I've never grown one myself, so it will be interesting to give it a go and just see what happens with it. I'm always a little bit suspicious of plants on weak root systems or weak growing plants. It's all well and good for containing the vigor of something like a cherry. It's not really so good in terms of keeping a healthy and productive plant. So I'm always a little bit skeptical about these sorts of things. So you see Patio peaches and other sorts of trees, and I've never really been tempted to look at them. But I thought, because it was offered as a free plant, it wouldn't be a bad thing if I gave one a try for myself and looked at how well or how poorly it might perform. I mean, I assume they do reasonably well. They must do, otherwise they'd stop selling them surely. But it'll be interesting anyway. So I've got to be honest, I am a little bit skeptical, but in any event, it doesn't cost me anything to give this a little try, and we'll follow it probably through next season and see how it's doing. So as I said, this is Sylvia. I don't really know anything about the variety. I can see it's been grafted at this point. The main stem has been cut here and it's been sealed with some wax. There's a bit of dodgy pruning here. I'll have to bring the camera in for a close-up on that. Left an inch-long stub above the bud there, and that's just going to die back. It's pretty late in the year to cut it, but I think it's probably just as well if I cut that off now, because that whole length is going to die back, and that's not what we want. So I will leave a link to their blog article in the video description. In this video, all I really want to do is take a look at it, the plant, and put it in a pot. Now, I'm going to deviate from common garden advice here. Very often we're told to just go up to the next pot size and increase the pot size gradually, and like a lot of common gardening advice, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not bad advice just to move on in pot size until you get to the largest pot you want to use. However, research has shown that there's not really any detriment in putting a plant into a big pot, and in fact there are some benefits in doing so. So I think the old advice about you can't go from a small pot to a large pot in one step, I don't think that's exactly accurate anymore, and it's certainly something I've done many times, I must confess, long before I realized that that advice maybe wasn't quite as accurate as one might imagine. For years I've been moving plants into pots that are probably thought to be a little bit too big for them. I'm going to do exactly the same today. I've got these buckets that I usually grow the potatoes in. It's a 15-litre pot. That is going to go straight in there, and yeah, it looks like I'm going up far too big in pot size, but to be honest, I don't really care. It's not going to cause any problem, I'm sure. So that's today's little job. One thing I've been taking a quick look at is the graft union, and this is the most important thing to look at if you're picking between trees. You can pretty much deal with anything above the graft point with pruning, and if this was all horrible up here, you can cut this back to a bud and effectively start from scratch. But the graft has got to be good, and I'm not so sure about this one. I think if I were picking this one out of a row of plants, I'm not sure I would pick this one. I've got to be honest about that. I mean, it's a free plant, so it's not a problem to me. The graft is probably okay. It's a whip and tongue graft, which is the right sort of graft. Personally, I would have grafted this a little bit lower down. I don't think the stem diameters match reasonably well, but somehow this graft has not healed particularly well in places. Still got some tape on it, and the tape is now perishing as it often does. And I'm going to remove that. It certainly doesn't want to be there anymore, and that will let me take a look at a bit of the graft that I think might be a wee bit dodgy. Yeah, this tape has been on plenty long. It's there's always a danger if the tape is on there too long that you crush the stem a little bit. There's a little bit of that here, but it's not too bad. But what I want to get to see is the top of this join, because I don't think it's actually healed very well. I need a knife just to cut the last bit of that tape away. I will bring the camera in closer and give you a little look at that. So, looking along the graft here, you can see a zigzag with where the classic whip and tongue graft has been made. It's calloused over reasonably on that side. I don't think it hasn't healed on the top. These pieces of wood did not match brilliantly. The tongue that's running up this side of the stem, that should blend in beautifully with this scion wood here, and it doesn't, and there's actually a gap here. that hasn't healed and will never heal. On this side, I think it's partially fused on the bottom here. This is not the best graft I've ever seen, that's for sure. It's probably, from a sort of functional perspective, I imagine it's okay. With the graft, you don't have to have 100% of the stems fused for the plant to grow okay, but I don't know. That's not great. I know it's a free plant and I was very happy to receive it, but I've got to be honest with you, I'm not that impressed with that particular graft. Now let me bring the camera in and show you what I'm talking about, because this is something you might want to look out for if you're picking a plant. This is the most important part of a tree to look at, I think, to start with. Whatever's going on above can be dealt with appropriate pruning and training. If the graft is no good, your tree will never be any good. So I hope this shows up okay on the camera, but here we've got the zigzag shape of the whip and tongue graft. So this is made by cutting the scion up the top and the rootstock down the bottom with matching cuts at quite a steep angle, and then you make another cut in both down into the stem here, and that forms this tongue, which then slots down into the corresponding cut in the rootstock. And this makes a pretty solid joint, so if you've done it well, this will almost hold in place on its own. You then whip it round with a bit of, well, you can use all sorts of material, but you can use the grafting tape or some raffia or whatever you want to use to just hold these pieces in place against the stems, and that's it. It's a nice grafting technique. It's probably the most common one to see on fruit trees like this. However, this one has some issues. These have not been matched up particularly well, in my opinion. So this piece here goes on up the stem. It shouldn't be quite like that. And up here, this is clear. There's a gap between this part of the rootstock and the scion. So this is not matched up well at all, and hasn't healed at all there. I imagine if I cut this off, which I probably will do, it's a nasty little hole for junk to get trapped in. If I cut that off, I'm pretty sure the bark on this side has not been removed here, so this doesn't line up particularly well. On the other side, let's have a little look. So the other side looked as though it healed okay. There's some nice callus material here. This side, not quite so good. You can see it's recessed in here. I'm almost certain that only part of the stems at this point have actually fused. As I said, it's not a problem. You don't need the entirety of the stems to fuse, but it ought to. It's not been done very nicely here. I would probably have grafted this a little bit further down. This is a nicer piece of clear stem. We haven't got these bits where old side shoots were. This is a nice piece of clear stem of pretty uniform diameter, and I would have looked, I think, to match these up a little bit better. I will cut that off here because I don't like this flapping nonsense. And then up the top you can see a bud here, which is fine, but then they've left this long length above it, and I mean, that's just really bad practice. You should be cutting that down here at an angle away from that bud, but that should be cut down here, because all of this will die back. I mean, there's no debate about that. This is not going to stay live. There's no bud here there's no growing point to take the sap. So this will die back, and it's the wrong thing to do. You need to cut this neatly above a bud, wherever you're cutting. I mean, that's true for any plant. You never cut in the middle of a stem like that. That's not ideal. So it's late to be cutting it, but it's better than leaving it. Let's get that in the right place. And you want to get the tips of the secateurs in there, really, so I don't damage that bud. There we go. That's much better. And then here I want to remove this flap of material that's not actually joined on. So I'm just going to cut that away, and let's have a look underneath. Well, no, I mean that bark hasn't been removed properly there, but I do not want to leave. I don't want to leave that flap of material where all sorts of junk will just get in there. Well, that's a little bit better. So I don't like the look of the graft there either. There's sort of a recess there. When you're looking at the grafts, if you see like here, you can see this sort of callus material sort of filling that joint nicely, and it's raised a little bit there. I'd much rather see this raised material than recesses. When you see it recessed like here, it's a pretty good sign that the cambium layer at this point has not actually fused, and that's a pity. So I'm feeling a little bit mean now because I've been criticizing this plant that was completely free of charge to me, but I will never give anything but my 100% honest opinion on this channel. I did have somebody contact me a few months ago offering me a free gadget of some sort in exchange for a 5-star review. To which I replied, of course, if you want a 5-star review, you better send me a 5-star product. Didn't hear from them again. But I'll never give anything except my honest opinion on this. This plant might be perfectly all right. I really can't tell at this stage. I think the graft could have been done with a little more care, but of course they're grafting, I imagine, a great many plants in a short period of time. It's hard to tell at this stage how a graft will develop over the coming years, provided there's a reasonable proportion of the cambium layers have fused nicely. It might be perfectly all right. But it's well worth looking. If you're faced with a row of plants in a nursery and you're picking one out, it's well worth taking a close look at the graft and picking one that looks like it's been well matched and well fitted together. Anyway, quick job now. Drop this in a pot full of soil. So what I've got in here is a mixture of some old potting soil and then homemade compost. This is a pretty nice mix, I would think, for this tree. I've got no crocks in the bottom of here. I'm afraid that also is a bit of a gardening myth. They don't really do much to help in the bottom of the pot. So one thing I am going to follow is not burying this stem any deeper than it is in this pot. There's a load of straw and loose organic matter on the top. I will take that away, but I want to honor this original soil mark. Let's have a look at the roots. It's not too bad actually. Just going to tease out a few of these very gently. You don't want to go in there ripping it apart but you don't want them working their way around, and actually square pots far better than round for that reason. Not only do they fill a space more efficiently than round pots, especially if you're got plants in propagators, the square pots really are much better, but the roots don't tend to spiral the same. So here I've not got roots winding around the outside of the root ball. This will be a dwarfing rootstock, so it's quite a fibrous rootstock. There are no particularly large roots here. Something a bit more substantial just starting up here. Yeah, I mean, it's a nice little root ball. It's not been in this pot overly long, so there's nothing to impede it getting established in here. If you've got a plant in a round pot and the roots are spiraled all the way round, it's very difficult then for that plant to get those roots out into the pot or into the soil. And that's why in general with fruit plants, I do like to use bare root plants. They establish, I think, rather better, especially if they've been in a pot for a long time. And if you're going to a garden centre, I've certainly seen plenty of fruit trees that have been hanging around quite a long time, and in that case that root ball is likely to be pretty congested, and I think then it needs quite a bit of work to try and break it up and help it get established. It's no good if in a couple of years' time you pull out your plant and maybe you go to repot it on and you find that that root ball is exactly as it was before, hasn't got into the pot at all, and that can happen. But that root system looks perfectly nice. I think it has a good chance, I think, of getting out into this pot. Homemade compost, bits of junk, of course. I don't want to compact this too much. This is quite loose material and it will undoubtedly slump a little bit when I give this a water. And yeah, that will do nicely. So I will find a spot in the garden to put that. It doesn't need a lot of water this time of year. It's got these leaves on, but these will die off pretty soon, and then this plant is going to go to sleep for a couple of months, and hopefully next spring we'll see a bit of action. There are some very nice young buds here, so yeah, I am hopeful that we'll get some good results from this. I've got 3 side shoots here with young buds on. That's not a bad place to start developing a little head on this tree. I will probably have to do a little bit of research on this sort of plant, because I know how to deal with the larger specimens, but these sort of dwarf patio fruit trees, I don't have a lot of experience with them. I've not seen one yet that's particularly impressive. My dad had a few. I think he had a cherry and a peach and whatever quite a few years ago now, but absolutely nothing came of those. But it'll be interesting to see how this does, and I will definitely return to this if I've got something to show you later on. But that is all for this video. It was supposed to be a very quick one, but as usual I've waffled on. But if you've got this far, thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.